welcome you to the Chill and Heal Show. My name is Steve Richard, and I'll be hosting today's program. And Alderman Chrissy Cantor is at the Republican National Convention, and she sends her love and warmest wishes to everybody here in Manchester. She's having a wonderful time. And one of the things I realized I did last week is I went right into the topic, Dan. And if I'm keeping with Chrissy's show, you know, there's an element here where we're supposed to breathe and relax and chill and think and process. And so I wanted to include that this morning as we get started. So with me today, I've got our esteemed guest, Daniel Richard. Daniel is a New Hampshire constitutional scholar and actually has a case before the New Hampshire Supreme Court as we speak.
Correct.
And so one of the things I'd like to do is just do a quick little recap, Dan, as to what we talked about last week, just for those that might be listening for the first time today.
Absolutely.
And I think one of those things is often we hear people talk about it. You know, we have a democracy. You know, and so the reality is we don't have a democracy. We have what's called a constitutional republic. And that functions very differently than a democracy does.
Absolutely.
And we also found out that although New Hampshire was one of the first states to declare themselves as its independent, if you will, it wasn't until later that other states wrote their constitution, and then they came back and said, all right, we're going to look at all the other ones that are written, and actually used the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as a template for our New Hampshire Constitution. And why does this matter? It matters because we're residents, we're habitants of the state of New Hampshire, and it's this Constitution that matters to us. So with that being said, where would you like to pick up from last week?
Yeah, let's jump off where we left last week, explaining the difference between a republic and a democracy. So we'll start with the democracy, which is what we evolved from. So in England, prior to the settling of North America and all the colonies that would come from that, they were operating under a monarchy, under a parliamentary monarchy.
Yeah.
And so under that form of government, the people had surrendered their sovereignty to the parliament. In other words, the parliament was acting in so-called their best interest. They made the laws of the land that governed the land of England. And so, as it did in Canada as well, because Canada is now also a subdivision, not a subdivision, but offshoot of that same type of legal reasoning and form of government, where the people of Canada have surrendered their sovereign powers to the Canadian Parliament. So the Canadian Parliament decides what's best for the people, whether it is or not. And when corruption enters the picture, it's nearly impossible to stop. You look at what's going on globally right now in Europe with the whole migrant problem, right? You have local politicians being bought off and forcing the new settlement of new people of different cultures, right? And causing all this chaos, and they are powerless to stop them.
It's not we the people.
It's not we the people, it's we the parliament. We the king and we the parliament.
That's right.
So fast forward, let's go backwards to the year 1776. New Hampshire writes the first constitution in the colonies, and the others would follow suit. But what was different about that is the sovereignty of the people was retained. So they ended up writing the laws of the land that would govern the people on within the territorial jurisdiction of New Hampshire. And within the body of that work is where I wanted to start off today. And so the very first article in the New Hampshire Constitution is the following: all government of right, not some, all government of right originates from the people, is founded in their consent. And the last sentence of that New Hampshire Constitution in 1784 reaffirms that fact and says this document cannot be altered without the consent of the voters.
So if I had a class, a living room full of fifth graders, and I told them you can have all the cookies on the table, would they misunderstand I can only have one or two cookies, or would they get all the cookies?
Well, that depends on how much schooling they've already had, right? But I'll give you
All is all. That's my point.
Exactly. And the best example of that is in the year 1850. From our history, we know that the state legislature only has the authority to propose changes to their authority. In other words, they don't get to self-grow the size of their government,
Yes.
of our government.
It's our government.
They have to get our consent because we're
That's
the
right.
author of their authority.
That's right.
So that's the major difference. And so the best example I can give is let's pick on the two political parties. So I'm going to pick on the Democrats first, and then I'm going to pick on the Republicans second, and give you a good example of how this works in a republic. So today, the Democratic Party is very upset about Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Yes.
And so the political class, the entire legal strategy or the whole political strategy for the Democrats right now is abortion, abortion, abortion. That's all they want to talk about. And so the problem is that their politicians are being disingenuous, and let me explain. In order for there to be a constitutional right to an abortion, it would have to be within the body of the state constitution. Because our state constitution, the second article, which I came prepared to read to you today, is very, very short, but it makes the all-important point. Natural rights. All men have certain natural and essential and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending of life and liberty. Who's doing the enjoying of defending life and liberty? You are.
Yeah.
This is these are the private rights of the people reserved unto them. That's why it's called the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And so back to the point, to protect life and liberty. Well, if the Constitution requires that the government protect life, how can you politically simply change the duty to protect life and now say we're going to terminate life? Or that the government has the ability to authorize the termination of life.
They don't have they don't have authorization.
It's the exact opposite charge, right?
Yes.
Because it goes on to say, acquiring and possessing and protecting property. In a word, seeking and obtaining happiness. So it's very important. That's why this document is so important.
Yes.
So with that in mind, if the people who believe that an abortion is a right, then there's a process to go by. And it's the same as it's the amendment process.
Yes.
And so if they want to do that, the legislature can propose such a change, get a 3/5 majority in both chambers, propose a constitutional amendment, submit it to the voters, and it would require 2/3 of the qualified voters of the state, the inhabitants, to authorize by a 2/3 majority that we're going to change the right to life and say there's no more right to life. And now government gets to decide who terminates life.
And so you're not going to hear that out there from any of the politicians, right?
No,
Because they want support, they want money, they want to maintain their power.
Right.
But the reality is, it's like in school, right? Give the teacher what they want, right? So I think about the Constitution, and unfortunately, most people don't understand the New Hampshire Constitution, the laws by which we are governed by, and so therefore, if you want to make a change, like you just described, then it needs to be proposed by the legislature, and then the people need to vote at the ballot box, and 2/3 need to amend. Did I get that right?
Exactly right.
Okay.
And fundamentally, that's the basis of my lawsuit. But let me back up a second. In the year 1850, there was 12 proposed amendments to the state constitution. 5 of them are very powerful for this example. 1, get rid of the executive council. Number 2, in its place, create an office of the lieutenant governor. 3rd, create a Department of Agriculture. 4, create a Department of Railroad. And 5, create a Department of Education. And 7 other changes that would amend the state constitution.
Yes.
They woke up in the morning of 1850 that summer and found that the voters said, no, we're not giving you any more power.
The voters said no.
The voters said, no, we don't want to give you any more power, right? And so when you study this, you'll find that from 1784 to the beginning of the 20th century, there were relatively few expansions of state governmental power.
Interesting.
It all starts to expand in the 20th century, where we start acting like a democracy, where people have forgotten the source of their authority and the limits of their power.
Yes.
And so now what they're doing is, and this is what the Democrats are doing, they're saying, hey, vote for us, we'll go to Washington D.C. or we'll go to Concord, and we'll pass legislation that will make abortion a right. But that's not the proper way to create a right.
There's a document that lays out how to try to accomplish that, and they haven't followed that. Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And so my lawsuit is about all these changes have been achieved by this process where the legislature has passed this legislation and the people didn't do, what did I say? Who's doing the defending and protecting? The Bill of Rights.
People are.
The Bill of Rights doesn't, it's a piece of paper.
Yes.
It doesn't stand up for itself. You have to stand
You
up
have
for
to
your
stand
own
up
rights.
for it. That's right.
And if you don't know your rights, you don't have any.
You don't have any.
And so that's the underlying issue. So now let's go to the Republicans and pick on them for
We're
a
going to
moment.
pick on them too?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Called you ma'am. It's supposed to be Chrissy. Anyway, so let's go to the Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment is different for the following reasons. In the U.S. Constitution, written in 1790, that came into effect in 1791, it's listed as the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So now what you have is an enumerated specific job assignment for your government. So we all know that we pay taxes at state and federal level, right? What do you receive in consideration for paying those taxes? Protection. Protection of what? Your life, your liberty, and your property. And so with that being said, one of your, as James Madison famously said, you have a property in your rights and a right to your property.
That's right.
And so your enumerated rights are there. So now the difference is government has a written duty. So when they raise their hand and they swear an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect your rights, it's a written mandate.
Yes.
Abortion is not.
Yes.
That's the big difference, right? So now, and here's the other thing that those that are left-leaning, remember, government big enough and strong enough, I'm paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson, is big enough and strong enough to take from you that which it gave you.
That's right.
And so Roe v. Wade was the decision, was not an amendment to either a state or federal constitution, but was rather the opinion of a federal judge.
Yeah.
He swayed the court, the U.S. Supreme Court, to render that opinion based on past precedent. But it wasn't codified in the Constitution.
Right.
And so when the court did its corrective course, as it's going on now, that's another story for another day, but the corrective course, when it comes, people feel like they've been cheated. So those who are angry at the Supreme Court shouldn't be angry at the Supreme Court because all they did was state the obvious. It's not written down. Right.
So Dan, if I could just add there, right? So what happened was they were misled
Yes.
by talking heads, by politicians, that this is the way that you can get it done, if you will.
Right.
And then the Supreme Court said, that's not the way that you get it done.
Right.
Am I simplifying it? Is that a fair
Absolutely.
way to say it? Okay.
Absolutely. So anyone who's upset with the Supreme Court shouldn't be, because all they did was reaffirm the law.
That's right.
And the law makes it clear that power doesn't exist in the Constitution, that there is no, quote, right to an abortion.
Right.
So I'm not advocating for or against, I'm stating the obvious.
You're using an example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when it comes to your rights, and it's a great segue into my lawsuit.
Yes.
So to explain to your
Dan,
audience,
yes,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I don't think many people know that you have a current lawsuit at the New Hampshire Supreme Court.
Correct.
And I believe, if I'm correct, it's actually is it against the current sitting governor, or is it against the state itself?
Yes, all the branches of government that are responsible for the election process have to be named in the suit. It's not a personal thing.
Yes.
So the office of the governor, the office of the Secretary of State, the office of the Attorney General, I have to name those individuals.
Right.
Now, if they act outside of their enumerated powers.
It's because of the office and the position that they hold. It has nothing to do with personal, but this has to do, just for viewers, this has to do with the election laws in the state of New Hampshire, in what our Constitution says, and how we may be coloring way outside the lines.
Right.
And I think everybody should really care about this, because whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're an independent, counting and having the people of inhabitants of this state being able to vote and having their vote count according to the New Hampshire Constitution matters.
Right.
And so, regardless of where you sit politically, I think everyone should be really interested in what's going on. And so I know for a fact, because Dan is not just my cousin, but he is also my friend. We've been talking for years and years and years now. And
It's been 4 years on this lawsuit.
it's been 4 years on this lawsuit. And so Dan has taken the time to, and I know for a fact, Dan, you also have a photographic memory, to research, do the enormous amount of work to research the law, to research what our founding fathers said as well,
Right.
and to actually bring a case to the state that says, hey, wait a second, somewhere back, and I'm not going to tell your story, but somewhere back maybe in the early 70s, we took a hard turn from, where we were, and we ended up where we are.
Right.
And so I just wanted to kind of set that table for everybody listening. This is not something that Dan just recently started. This is something, it's really been part of your life's work the last, I want to say, probably a decade, maybe close to a decade. This has been your
Absolutely.
life's work. Is that fair?
It has been, because what I set out to do is find out what I knew that I was being lied to as a citizen, and watching the media and living life. I finally understood that we're not being told the truth. So I set out to uncover what the real deal was. And once I learned a very important tool, and anyone who has interest in studying the subject matter, and that is, how do the courts examine these issues? How do the courts examine these questions?
Yes.
Because the average person will pick up the state constitution or the U.S. Constitution, they'll read it, and they'll apply a modern day understanding on a document that's several hundred years old.
That was written a long time ago.
So we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to summarize quickly the basis of the lawsuit. And by the way, my lawsuit is atypical of all of the growth, the illegal growth of state government, and this is the manner in which it's been achieved. First, the definition of a qualified voter is key to understanding how they change the election process. The word inhabitant is used in the state constitution to define specifically that you are a qualified voter. You're qualified to elect or to be elected to office. And more importantly, it's the only word in the state constitution that has its own definition. That's it, it's the only word. It's used in 33 places, and it has a legal definition. It doesn't mean that you inhabit a house. It means you possess political rights. And that's the key difference. So that got changed. And when they changed it, they inadvertently started causing conflict with other provisions of the Constitution, because both documents have a synergy to them. The state constitution, ratified in 1784, was followed by the U.S. Constitution 4 years later. So it was the same men that wrote both documents. So the guys who wrote their state constitutions went to Philadelphia, and so you can see, if you want to really know what the U.S. Constitution says, read those 13 state constitutions that were written before the U.S.
All
Constitution.
the same people.
It's all the same people. And the half of the states said, we'll adopt this new constitution on one condition, that you adopt a Bill of Rights, because each state had a Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And they wanted to restrain the federal government. So the federal Bill of Rights, the major difference, by the way, is that the federal Bill of Rights is a prohibition on the federal government, whereas the state Bill of Rights is a mandate. It's a social contract between you and your state government. That's it. So when I uncovered these changes were being done, so what they were doing is simply exceeding their legal authority and changing the election law mandated by the Constitution and writing a statute. So in sequence fundamentally is this. The right to change our election laws has been unconstitutional since at least 1864. Now I can say that with great certainty because in 1864, the state legislature was dealing with the Civil War, and many of the men who had volunteered to support the Civil War effort were not here. And each constitution in the state, in its original text, had no provision for absentee voting.
Yes.
So you had to vote in person. You couldn't vote by proxy.
Right.
So they asked, can we get away with passing legislation? They said no. The legislature, that's the difference between our agents being our agents and representatives versus we being sovereign, right? The employees, think of it this way, if you own a business, right? If you write an employee handbook and put the rules as to how employees are hired, and then these new employees that you've hired come in and rewrite the manual as to how they reelect themselves. No, that's the problem here.
So that's a great analogy because that's exactly what has happened in the state of New Hampshire, probably other states as well. But we're focused on here.
So it's repeated 50 years later, by the way. So in 1921, World War I happens. The Supreme Court says the same thing. We told you 50 years ago that the state legislature has no authority to grant anybody the right to vote. So it can't say, hey, my babysitter won't show up. The weather won't. That's part of my lawsuit, right?
I'm sick.
Yeah, I'm sick. My boss won't let me off of work. I'm claiming a religious exemption. The National Weather Service has forecasted bad weather. Or my favorite, I'm incarcerated and can't get to the polling station because I'm in jail, right? So all of these things were done by the legislature without an amendment. Because the reason we have absentee voting now, the result of the backstory was all the states went about amending their state constitutions and permitting absentee voting for two reasons. You're physically out of your voting district on election day, or you're physically disabled and can't vote in person because of a physical disability.
Right.
And that was, by the way, that's exactly what they asked the Supreme Court. Can we do this by statute? The court said no.
No.
You have to do it by the amendment process.
Which includes the people having to vote and getting 2/3 passed.
Exactly. And that happened in 1942.
Interesting.
So that's how, and so part of my argument is look, if it took an amendment to the state constitution to authorize those two exemptions for absentee voting, and those are the two qualifications, why would now in the 20th century that principle that I started with, the first and last sentence of the state constitution, all government of right originates from the people, which means power and authority. And the last sentence, that it can only be done so with the consent of the voters themselves.
So Dan, we've got about 5 minutes left in our program. Summarize this for those, based on the current, the case that you have in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Supreme Court, which you've argued for yourself. You didn't go out and hire an attorney.
No.
Because you can, it's your case, so you can represent yourself. Please try and summarize the next couple of minutes, what that means to them.
Yeah, we're going to get a decision real soon out of the state Supreme Court, I believe. It's been 8 months since oral arguments. And the other big thing that's going on that is affecting the case in a major way is the recent decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes.
Those recent decisions have now, for those who understand the Chevron deference, I don't have time to explain it today, but these bunch of cases, EPA versus Ohio, Securities and Exchange Commission versus Jarsky, and Loper Bright versus Redondo, all of those cases have destroyed the administrative state. So the New Hampshire Ballot Law Commission is responsible for making the rules and regulations to authorize voting machines. That's the second part of my lawsuit.
Yes.
And so that's now been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, that the Ballot Law Commission no longer has any constitutional authority to function whatsoever.
That's massive.
It's massive.
So Dan said this. He said the administrative state, right? So basically, I'm going to just simplify for myself, right? The administrative state means, hey, we're gonna govern ourselves. We're gonna just put people in place that weren't voted in, and kind of do what we want.
Let me give you the Jarsky example because we're running out of time.
Yes.
Securities and Exchange Commission was created following an act of Congress, okay, to regulate the exchange of money. What do you call that? What's the legal term for securities? Financial instruments. That's the word I was struggling for. Financial instruments. So the Securities and Exchange Commission sued him. But here's what they did. They changed the name of the legal proceeding to deny him a trial by jury. One of the landmark cases of an American is the right to not be deprived of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law and a jury of your peers.
That's right.
And so what happened is in that case they said, no, you can't change the nature of the case and then hire your own judges, make your own rules, hire your own judges, hire your own prosecutors, police your whole agenda, and then prosecute Mr. Jarsky and fine him. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And we have the same problem with the Ballot Law Commission. The Ballot Law Commission has been granted judicial power where that power is reserved to the state legislature. The House is supposed to stand in judgment of its returns, and so is the Senate. So they had no authority to give under administrative rule this new power to the Ballot Law Commission to act as a judicial body. And then in 79, they expanded that power by granting them the power to make rules enforced as law, to decide what machines should or should not be used. None of those lawyers are electrical engineers. They don't know anything about voting machines. And then finally, to enforce their entire agenda. Under the Supreme Court precedent of the last 2 weeks, that agency is now dead.
I mean, basically they got a whip and they just got it snapped right back into place. That's what I'm hearing.
And the reason it's going to apply in New Hampshire right now is because of my case. Because I filed earlier this week into the court adding these new precedents. So we're not going to have to wait for someone to sue Labor Department or Health and Human Services and go through a multiple year process. Now it went right to the front of the line because my case is pending an opinion. So it's going to have an immediate impact, and the reason it applies is because the Ballot Law Commission, when it exercises its rulemaking power, operates under federal jurisdiction when it writes rules for federal elections.
Wow.
That's why it's binding on them.
So for those listening, let's just highlight the couple of things that is really on the chopping block. One is voting machines.
Right, they're done.
Voting machines, according to what the U.S. Supreme Court, their decision a couple of weeks ago, should have a domino effect in this state that says that we did not, just for everyone listening, we did not go through the legislation process of amending our law that said that we can use voting machines.
Like they did in Massachusetts?
Like they did in Massachusetts. People, I just want you to understand that. Like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts went through that process. And the people of Massachusetts voted for it, and they said yes.
And we did not.
We did not.
And that's where they got in a whole bunch of trouble.
Oh, boy.
And by the way, the decision, the Supreme Court decisions
We've got 30 seconds, Dan.
The Supreme Court decisions it's not about the voting machine, it's about fruit of the poisonous tree. The Ballot Law Commission, in its creation of its statutory authority, is defective and needs to be struck down by the New Hampshire Supreme Court.
Well, with that, it's been quite a program, Dan, and I know there's a lot more. We're going to stay on Facebook Live for a couple of minutes here, but there's a lot more to cover here, and we should hear something soon. In summary, I think what we want people to know is, learning the New Hampshire Constitution is incredibly important. If you don't know your rights, you have no rights, and we, the people, have rights in the state of New Hampshire, and we have to follow the proper process to get things amended. So whatever your topic is that you're going for, there's a process to follow, like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts did. We would need to do here as well.
Right.
So with that being said, I want to thank everybody for listening, and want to shout out to Chrissy Cantor, who's out at the RNC. And thank everybody, and thank you for today's episode.